Hello everyone. Good turnout for a pretty crummy October evening. Starting to feel like winter finally, but I don't know if I'm happy about that or sad. But we'll get started with the Pledge of Allegiance. If anybody would like to rise the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you all. Just some announcements before we get started with tonight's meeting. First and foremost, I'm sure most of you here are aware of our gravestone cleaning that is happening in the rural cemetery. We are cleaning if you are a new member or if you're someone who is just new to the group. Welcome. Happy to have you here. Make sure you see Bob Lytle in the back so you can be added to our email list and all of our correspondence. But we began last spring to undergo a project to clean the Civil War era GAR specifically, so the Grand Army of the Republic, which is the veterans group which forms after the American Civil War in Rural Cemetery here in New Bedford. The GAR post number 1, the first one in Massachusetts, the William Logan Rodman post, purchased a plot in the cemetery to be set aside for members of the GAR post and their families to be buried together in the wake of the Civil War. So most of them are veterans, all people who either served or their family members. There's several wives and daughters also buried there too. There's a little over 300 graves. We began the process this spring of recording each one of those graves. I'm happy to announce, with all of the extra free time I've had on my hands in the last month, since September 28th, which was my last official day of working. Hopefully that'll change soon again. I've been able to take all of that work that folks did with the recording and put that into spreadsheets, and those spreadsheets will hopefully be included on our website and also will be uploaded to things like Find a Grave. Critical information which helps historians and people who do their ancestry and all that get a lot of important information about the people who are buried there. So we did that in the spring. Back in late September, yeah, it was the morning of the meeting, right? In September, we sprayed an initial spraying of D2 biological solution on all of the graves. On October 15th, we're starting to see some progress, which is really kind of neat. So some of these graves, it's going to take quite a bit of time with the D2 biologic working, and the sun helps, raining helps, all of that stuff helps the solution to do its work. So we're starting to see progress. We are going to have another day of work on Sunday, November 9th. That is the Sunday right before Veterans Day. Veterans Day falls on a Tuesday this year. That is the Sunday right before that. We'll meet at that section on at 1 o'clock. So if you are interested, please see me, send me an email, or you can check in with me after the meeting. We'll need some hands. We're going to do another spraying. All the graves are going to get sprayed again. They're all getting another round of spraying. And some of the graves, like this one is a good example. There's a lot of moss buildup. We're going to need to give it a little light scrubbing. So if you're willing to do a little bit more work than spraying, let me know. It's a very light brushing basically of that that'll help to get that off. Will help to get these graves looking really nice. But some of these graves are already starting to show great progress, like that one up there. So hopefully by the spring, most of them will be looking pretty close to that one where the red laser pointer is on the top right of the screen. But if you can join us on Sunday, November 9th, please do. And just keep an eye out for emails and updates. Hopefully the weather should cooperate. But if you have to reschedule, we will. I want to remind folks, too, of our annual holiday dinner on Tuesday, December 9th at 6 p.m. We'll be doing our annual holiday dinner. Tickets are $38 per person. It's hosted at the Century House in Acushnet. We've done it there the last, 3-4 years now, I think. Peter's shaking his head. That's always a good sign when Peter shakes his head at me. It's a great meal, honey baked ham, New England baked scrod, which is really, I don't like seafood that much. I know, shame, I'm a New Englander, right? But that scrod was delicious last year. Country fried chicken, bread bliss, mashed potatoes, rice pilaf, green beans, mixed salads, ice cream with chocolate sauce, my personal favorite, and coffee and tea. And actually, I lied, my personal favorite is the cash bar. But so if you can join us that evening, please see Bob Lytle in the back. He can sell you tickets, drag a friend, a family member along with you. We hopefully will fill up the room that evening. This past I guess a week and a half ago now, I received a very sad email from Karen, who is the daughter of James D. Murray. Jim was a longtime member of the round table, would always sit right up front here with these two fine gentlemen. Unfortunately, Jim passed away after a short illness. So I just ask that you all keep Jim and his family in your thoughts and prayers in this time. We'll certainly miss him. If you are able to attend, the arrangements are tomorrow from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. visiting hours, and then the memorial service at the funeral home to follow after that. And that'll be at the Chapman Funeral Home and Cremation Center in Wareham, Massachusetts. So unfortunate, sad news, but Jim will always be with us in our memories, certainly. The board has discussed the possibility, and I think that this would be a nice tradition to begin, the idea of the round table making a donation to the American Battlefield Trust on behalf of our deceased members every year. So maybe at the end of every speaking season, we put forth a donation on behalf of all of our deceased members to the important work that the American Battlefield Trust does, preserving and protecting our battlefields all across this country. So that may be something that we'll adopt doing in the future. Last thing I wanted to make you all aware of is that the November meeting is not the fourth Tuesday. We do the fourth Tuesday of the month for almost every single month, except for November. That's because the fourth Tuesday falls in the week of Thanksgiving. So we'll be meeting on the third Tuesday of the month in November, November 18th at 6 p.m. Same time, and Robert Foster of the Lincoln Group of Boston will be talking to us about the true meaning of the Confederate flag, then and now. So please note that is the third Tuesday of the month next month, and not the fourth Tuesday of the month. With that being said, I would like to now introduce tonight's speaker. So we're lucky enough to be joined this evening by Dr. Andrew Zwilling. Andrew Zwilling is an associate professor of strategy and war in the College of Distance Education at the Navy War College down in Newport. His current research centers on the British Empire and the Mediterranean region during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. His areas of expertise include the British Empire, colonial America, and early modern Europe. Before joining the resident faculty in Newport in 2018, he served as an adjunct professor of strategy and war in the College of Distance Education on location for 6 years. He holds a PhD in history from Florida State University. It's now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Zwilling for tonight's presentation.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you so much for inviting me here to speak to you guys tonight. As Mark mentioned, can we switch over to...
Oh, sorry. I thought my work was done.
There we go. So, as Mark mentioned, I am Dr. Andrew Zwilling, and tonight I am going to be talking to you about the defense of New Orleans, Confederate New Orleans. Now, before we start, very good song. Before we start, I have to make a disclaimer. The views and arguments I make tonight are not necessarily representative of the United States Navy or the Department of the Defense or anyone else but my own. And you can see the little disclaimer here. We're required to do that every time. I just need you guys to know that. I make that disclaimer because, like Mark mentioned, I'm a professor of strategy and policy at the U.S. Naval War College in Newport. A little background, like Mark mentioned, I have a PhD in history, and I specialize in the history of the 18th and 19th century British Empire, colonial America, and I also focus a little bit on American military history. My two books that I've published thus far are on the War for American Independence and on the British colony of Malta during the late 18th, early 19th century. But one of my first loves in history, and indeed what I have my master's degree in, is the United States Civil War, the American Civil War. And so that is why I've always loved the Civil War, and that is why tonight we're going to be talking about it. So what are we going to be talking about? Well, the city of New Orleans surrendered to Union forces on the 29th of April, 1862, just a little over a year after the Civil War began. The loss of the city stunned the Confederacy, absolutely shocked it. It was both a strategic disaster for the Confederacy and, to be frank, really, really embarrassing for them. But it should not have been unexpected, because what I'm arguing today is that the failed defense of Confederate New Orleans was a microcosm of the larger strategic problems that were plaguing the Confederacy from the start of the war. Now, to help prove this argument, it is first necessary to talk about those larger strategic issues. There we go. Strategic problem number one, the nature of the war. Now, those of you who might be familiar with American professional military education likely know that the Prussian military theorist, right there, Karl von Clausewitz, is a favorite in American military circles. Now, tonight is not the place to talk about the merits and pitfalls of relying too heavily on Clausewitz, but I bring him up because I particularly like his thoughts on the nature of the war. Clausewitz emphasizes, quote, the first, the supreme, the most far-reaching act of judgment that the statesman and commander have to make is to establish by that test the kind of war on which they are embarking, neither mistaking it for nor trying to turn it into something that is alien to its nature. In other words, you have to know the type of war that you're fighting. And in some ways, understanding the nature of the war was easy for the Confederacy. As a group, they had elected to try and secede from the United States. This meant that for the Confederacy, the war was mostly defensive. They didn't necessarily need to take territory, they just had to wait out the Union. In many ways, this is similar to the strategic situation of the American Revolution. The American rebels during that war needed to wait out the British, both the British people and the British government, and wait them out until the British people decided that the cost of prosecuting the war was too much and they needed to let go of the colonies. Similarly, the biggest problem for Jefferson Davis and his cabinet was that they needed to convince the North that the effort expended to keep the Confederate States in the Union was not worth the blood and treasure expended. But fighting a defensive war is very difficult, particularly one spread out over such a large area and with so many theaters of battle. And so they had to understand, they had to have a good concept of the type of war they were fighting. And I would argue that Jefferson Davis and his cabinet did not have that understanding. And we're going to break down the nature of the war a little bit further with strategic problem number two, international recognition. Fighting a war of independence, a war of secession, is much easier if the international community recognizes your legitimacy. Again, I'm going to go back to the American Revolution. It's a good example. One of the key turning points of that war was in 1778, when the French recognized the American patriots as a legitimate cause and that they were fighting a legitimate war. International recognition of the Confederate States of America could have brought a number of advantages that would have made their defensive war much easier to prosecute, especially if the two biggies, Great Britain and France, had given them recognition. For example, it would have allowed British and French merchants and naval forces to directly intervene into the war if they saw fit. They could have easily challenged the Union blockade, allowing for Southern commerce to flow outwards and war supplies to come into theater. Furthermore, and arguably most importantly, it would allow the Confederates to purchase warships directly from France and Great Britain. As I'm sure you all are more than aware, the Confederates did purchase these warships from France and Britain. In many cases, they were built in ports in Great Britain and France, but they were ultimately blocked from sale and delivery by the French and the British governments because of that lack of international recognition. Finally, recognition would have weakened the Union's narrative and shown implicit support by the international community for the slave-based society that the Confederacy was trying to build. Central to this issue was King Cotton diplomacy. And central to King Cotton diplomacy was the Confederacy's primary export, cotton. Both Great Britain and France were heavily reliant on Southern cotton exports that fueled the British and French textile industries. Faced with a Union blockade at the ports, Confederate leadership and, more importantly, Confederate factors and merchants, the actual growers and sellers of the cotton, hoped that the British and French reliance on Southern cotton would lead them to diplomatically recognize the South, the Confederacy. It was a balancing act that they didn't particularly do a good job at, because you have a de facto cotton embargo combined with the image of diplomatic bullying. The decision to withhold cotton from Europe in 1861 was spontaneous. It wasn't designed by Jefferson Davis and his cabinet as a policy tool. It was designed by those merchants and factors who sold the cotton as a way to try and essentially force the issue for Great Britain and France. Now, later on, the Confederate government did go along with the proposal, but really this was unplanned. It was a spontaneous use of what they thought was their diplomatic levers. The problem was, A, this looks like bullying. No one likes to be told, hey, we got to do something or else you're not going to get what you're not going to get the cotton. But the bigger problem was in 1860, the cotton export crop was huge. It was gigantic. The South sold a lot of cotton to Great Britain and France. Liverpool's warehouses were filled. And so the problem was, it meant that in 1861, places like Liverpool, which might have tried to exert their influence on the British government to recognize the Confederacy because of the lack of cotton, they didn't really care. They had enough to last them, and that bought them time to find other sources of cotton. The leverage that the Confederates thought they had was simply not there. And we'll talk a little bit about how New Orleans fits into that in a second. The next strategic problem that the Confederacy had was dealt with naval forces. Now, this is a defensive war, and you need international recognition and cotton diplomacy, using cotton diplomacy. If that's going to be successful, you have to be able to have access to those markets. You have to be able to send your products eventually. Even if you're not sending them now, eventually you have to send those products to markets. Well, Lincoln declared a blockade of the Confederacy in April of 1861, pretty soon thereafter, after the war started. Now, this was a problem for the Union, to be fair, particularly the Secretary of Navy, Gideon Welles, because at the beginning of the war, the Union only had roughly 90 vessels of all ships. These weren't just warships. These are not all told 90 vessels of varying classes that were operationally ready to fight the war and do a blockade. That's not nearly enough to blockade a single state, let alone the entirety of the Confederacy. Now, Gideon Wells undertook a rapid shipbuilding program to try and build and convert any ship it could get his hands on. And he was relatively successful with that. But as bad as the Union's naval situation was and how they had to encircle the Confederacy with a blockade with ships they didn't have, the Confederacy's naval situation was far worse. Gideon Wells's counterpart in the Confederacy was Stephen R. Mallory. And if Wells started out with 90 ships, Mallory started out with close to nothing. It was a difficult situation to be in. He had experienced naval officers and crewmen, but no ships for them to crew. In some cases, Confederate naval officers refused to steal their ships that they captained or they crewed because they didn't want to be dishonorable. Now, I've always tried to square that in my head of you're rejecting the Union, you're becoming traitors and you're seceding, but stealing a ship is a step too far. That never really squared with me. But nonetheless, he had a lot of experienced officers and crewmen, but he didn't have any ships. It was a very difficult strategic situation to be in. The Confederacy needed a navy to protect its ports. They needed to be able to disrupt the blockade. They needed to be able to attack Union commerce and protect the inland waterways. Now, to Mallory's credit, he understood that the Confederacy, at least in the short term, was never going to be able to beat out the Union's production capability and ability to produce and build and crew ships. I actually have a point of comparison to highlight this issue. At their respective heights, so late 64, early 65, the Union Navy had 51,500 men and almost 17,000 mechanics and laborers on its payroll, and over 600 active ships. The Confederate Navy, at the end of 1864, had 5,000 men and a little over 100 ships at that point. So there's a big difference in what they're going to be able to produce. So Mallory adopted a strategy of quality over quantity. He focused on new technologies like ironclads, torpedoes, steam rams. Now, when I say torpedoes, I'm sure you guys know, we're not talking about the launch torpedoes that we have nowadays and that we saw in World War I, World War II. We're literally talking about an explosive on a stick that you try and get close, knock it into the ship, and then run away before it explodes. But that was still a new technology, sort of. Mallory's idea was that they might have fewer ships, the Confederacy might have fewer ships, but their technological advantage is going to make them win the day. Now remember, they don't need to invade northern ports, they don't need to necessarily even sink the entire Union Navy, they just need to keep their commerce and ports open and free so they can stop the constriction of the blockade. It's a good strategy in theory. Unfortunately for the Confederacy and Stephen R. Mallory, it rarely worked. I've often described the Confederate naval strategy as build it and burn it. Because there were so many times that the Confederacy would spend all this time, money, and energy building a ship, building an ironclad, and then not quite getting it operationally ready before the Union came, and they were forced to scuttle or burn that newly built ship because the encroaching Union would have taken it for themselves otherwise. The problem was, for Mallory and for the Confederacy, is that even if Mallory wanted to focus on quality and innovation, the Confederacy needed manufacturing in order for it to make those dreams come true. The fact of the matter was, the South, the Confederacy, was significantly outclassed in terms of manufacturing facilities and easily accessible resources when it came to the Union and the North. It's not to say things were completely hopeless. There was manufacturing in Tennessee and Virginia. Tredegar Iron Works, which is imaged here, is the most famous and largest factory in the Union during the war. And in theory, given time, these could be expanded and brought up to scale to help, arm and supply the entirety of the Confederacy, form the backbone of a Confederate industry. There were also numerous small shops and foundries and manufacturers spread out, but they weren't linked, and it was not on the scale of the North. New Orleans in particular was designated as a Confederate manufacturing depot for things like naval engines and ordnance stores, caps, fuses, shells, all the things you need to supply your ship in order to make it combat ready. If given enough time, and in theory, they could have been unified and expanded enough to meet the Confederacy's wartime needs. But they didn't have time. This was a defensive war, but the blockade was occurring now. Even though it was a loose blockade, they didn't have enough ships. It was going to get tighter and tighter and tighter. The problem was time. The Confederacy needed a navy, they needed an army, they needed arms, they needed cannon, they needed everything sooner rather than later. Not for nothing. I have this image up here. The other issue is, even if you could build stuff in Kentucky or Tennessee or Virginia, all the way up here, you had to be able to ship it to the areas where they were needed. And Confederate railroads were woefully inadequate at the beginning of the war, and they did not get much better during the course of the conflict. And as you can see here, well, it's very difficult to see, but you'll have access, if anyone wants my slides, feel free, Don, to hand them out, or send to anyone who wants them. You have different colors of railway. These are green, these are red, and there's also an orange and brown here speckled throughout. Those are all different gauges of track. And so in order to get them from one to the other, you have to switch them and transfer them over. They're not all operating off the same gauge, and it caused significant issues when trying to bring things back and forth. So that's the issue with manufacturing. There we go. The final strategic problem I want to talk about is good leadership. And now this is equally shared by the Confederacy and the Union. They were constantly challenged with trying to find the best officers and making sure those officers were given command at the right time in the right place. This was an amateur war fought by mostly amateur officers, many of whom were learning on the job. And this often led to the wrong generals, the wrong leaders being placed in command where they shouldn't have been. Think McClellan for the Union, or Bragg, or Hood, or Johnston, or there's a number of them for the Confederacy, including Lee, but we don't have to talk about that right now. That's my own personal opinion. But they both had issues with putting the right leaders in at the right time. And time was a factor. If the right leaders were not in place in enough time to make the right decisions, it's not going to matter. If they can't make a difference, if they can't actually get the job done, it's not going to matter. So those are the strategic challenges faced by the Confederacy. Now let's move to New Orleans and examine why its failed defense is a microcosm of those larger strategic issues, and how the Confederacy failed to successfully navigate those larger strategic issues. Now, New Orleans. It is hard to undersell, it's difficult to undersell how important a city New Orleans was to the South. How important of a city it was. Before secession, New Orleans was the largest city in the South. It's the second largest city in the United States, second only to New York City. Its geographic location made it strategically and economically important. New Orleans sits at the mouth of the Mississippi River. Trade going from the Gulf northwards or down the Mississippi towards the Gulf had to pass through the city. Because of its location and the merchant community that coalesced in the city, New Orleans was a commercial powerhouse. In 1860, roughly half of all cotton in the South came through New Orleans on its way to Salem. It was also the primary center in the South for the importation of manufactured goods from Europe. Finally, it was the center of the U.S. Mint, which minted both, it was center of a U.S. Mint, not the U.S. Mint, a U.S. Mint, which minted both gold and silver coinage. In terms of raw numbers, in 1860, the combined value of all receipts in New Orleans was $185 million. Of that, $134 million was made up from cotton alone. If King Cotton diplomacy was to be successful, be it holding it back until they recognize or selling it when they realize that that's not going to work, the Confederacy needed New Orleans as one of the primary shipping entrepôts and commercial centers. But Andrew, you might want to ask me, if New Orleans was so important, why wasn't the Confederate war effort centered on making sure that the city was defended properly, centered on making sure the waterways were kept clear so the largest and most important city in the Union, or not in the Union, sorry, in the Confederacy, were kept clear and safe and then operational for the Confederacy? Well, one of the reasons that insofar as the Confederacy goes, New Orleans was an odd, weird city compared to the rest of the South. It was cosmopolitan in nature. Its origins were found in French and Spanish settlers. Many of the merchants and the elite in the city had strong connections to northern cities and northern manufacturers and northern economic interests. Or in many cases, they were born in the North, and therefore they weren't trusted. And many merchants in New Orleans were not trusted by everyone else in the Confederacy. Even though, by and large, the people of New Orleans and the city of New Orleans policy was pro-slavery, pro-secession. The problem was, another reason they weren't trusted is New Orleans was a free city before the war. This meant that there were free blacks in the city that could live and prosper, and did live and prosper. So it was an odd duck when it came to cities in the Confederacy. There's also significant evidence. Remember how I talked about the cotton embargo, that King Cotton, the cotton embargo of 1861 was not designed by the Confederate government, but was spontaneous by the cotton factors. Well, there's a lot of evidence that that spontaneity, that push to restrict cotton sales to Europe to try and force them to recognize diplomatically, that originated in New Orleans. It originated with those cotton factors, with those merchants who controlled so much of the flow of cotton. And really, when you look into the communications from Richmond and look at the amount of effort, or lack thereof, that went into defending the city, you draw the conclusion, and at least I did when I was researching this, that the Confederacy really didn't care much. If they didn't care much about the city, they at least didn't think about it very much. It wasn't in their mind. Now, a kinder interpretation, a less cynical interpretation, would be that the Confederacy was so lost, so spread thin in 1861 and 1862, that they did not have the bandwidth. They were focused on so many other issues, so many other problems. They didn't have simply the bandwidth to focus on New Orleans like they probably should have. But no matter what, no matter how you interpret the lack of interest by the Confederate government with New Orleans, it was clear that the Confederate leadership, in ignoring New Orleans for the most part, did not understand the nature of the war, and therefore did not put as much emphasis on the defense of New Orleans like they should have. This is further seen with the leadership of New Orleans, because the leadership tasked with defending New Orleans was an example of the Confederacy placing the wrong leaders in at the wrong time. The first person in charge was this gentleman, right here. Major General David E. Twiggs. He was a veteran of the War of 1812, the Seminole Wars, and the Mexican-American War. This meant that he was very old. He was 70 years old and in bad health when he took over on May 31st, 1861. He took over command of Department Number 1, which was the defense of Louisiana and the southern parts of Alabama and Mississippi. So he was 70 years old and in bad health when he took over. He came over from Texas to control the defense of the city. Now, if you're in bad health, you're not going to be able to get much done. He had difficulty leaving his quarters on most days. And in no way, shape, or form could he actually perform the duties upon which he was tasked to do. You can't even call his term of leadership uninspired, because that implies any actual leadership occurred under Twiggs. He simply didn't do anything. By October, he was too ill to continue on, and he resigned citing his health of October of 1861, and in his place, Brigadier General Mansfield Lovell took over. Right here. Lovell was born in Washington, D.C. He was 39 years old, not sick, and had the energy and the will to defend the city that Twiggs lacked. Problem was, as a 39-year-old DC resident, he did not have the gravitas or influence within the larger Confederate leadership to actually get stuff done. He, frankly, wasn't trusted. People didn't trust him. He lived in New York before the war. He didn't join the Confederacy until September of 1861. And furthermore, Braxton Bragg thought he was going to get the position assigned to Lovell, but instead Lovell got it. And so that created another point of friction and lack of trust within the larger Confederate leadership and Lovell. Some examples of how he was not trusted and how it affected the defense of New Orleans. Jefferson Davis refused Lovell's request to place Confederate naval forces under the unified command of the person in charge of defending the city. He just flat out refused. Furthermore, during both Twiggs and especially Lovell's commands, troops were raised in Louisiana, were raised in New Orleans, were outfitted in New Orleans, and then sent to Virginia or Tennessee to fight there instead of staying to defend the city. Gunboats and rams, small ships that couldn't take on a warship but could contribute to the defense of the city, were built by both the government and private citizens in New Orleans, and those were ordered sent north up to the Mississippi, as opposed to stay in New Orleans and defend the city in which they were built. Richmond and Davis were convinced the threat to New Orleans was not in the south, but in the northern part of the Mississippi. Lovell also had very few commanders under him that he could trust. There was one exception to this rule. I have him up here. That's Brigadier General Johnson Duncan. And he commanded the defense of the two forts, which we'll talk about in a second, that guarded the Mississippi River south of New Orleans, and that were the primary means of defense. Now, Lovell did what he could, but given the larger manufacturing and naval issues of the Confederacy as a whole, and the fact that because he wasn't trusted and his word wasn't trusted, he was being drained of what he had for the war effort elsewhere, New Orleans was in a bad spot. There's a quote from Secretary of War Judah Benjamin, who was responding to Lovell, who had complained about being drained of resources to defend the city because of the fight up north. Quote, "New Orleans is to be defended from above by defeating the enemy at Columbus. The forces now withdrawn from you are for the defense of your own command." In other words, don't worry about it. You're being defended up north. That's where the threat is. Suck it up. When it comes to the naval forces defending New Orleans, there were another of small rams and gunboats built for the city's defense. Some stayed, most were sent north. But those aren't what I want to focus on tonight, because they honestly don't really matter. What did matter were two ironclads that were being built for the defense, built in New Orleans for the defense of New Orleans, and they were being built simultaneously. The intention was that they were going to be built, they could defend New Orleans, and then go out in the blue water of the Gulf and break the blockade. They were the CSS Louisiana and the CSS Mississippi. Louisiana was designed and built by E.C. Murray, an accomplished shipbuilder, and designer who knew his way around the New Orleans markets and building culture. The Mississippi was designed and built by Nelson and Asa Tift, brothers from Key West who knew, who had contacts within the Confederate government. They were brothers from Key West, and they had never built a ship in their life before the Mississippi, let alone what the Mississippi was destined to be, which was a modern, brand spanking new ironclad warship. These two ships were perfect examples of Mallory's vision for the Confederate Navy. These were going to be modern, ironclad warships with modern weaponry and armor that could withstand the strongest naval cannons. Both vessels were intended to serve on the Mississippi to defend the city and be blue water capable to break the blockade. So when they finally decided to ship out the cotton, New Orleans could send out the merchant ships into the Gulf of Mexico. Now, they're both designed to be heavily armed and armored, and they're going to be able to contest any ship that the Union could send out against it. But in addition to being a perfect example of Mallory's vision, they were also a perfect example of the larger strategic failures of the Confederacy and the Confederate Navy. Both ships far overran their completion dates, and neither ship was finished before the Union attacked New Orleans. The Louisiana had armor and guns, but no engines, and the Mississippi wasn't even that far along. Her armor plating was sitting in Mobile, but there wasn't enough rolling stock to get it to New Orleans on time and installed before the Union attacked. She was scuttled, the Mississippi was scuttled as Farragut approached the city. So once again, build it and burn it. Both builders, both Murray and the Tift brothers, were faced with building shortages, shortage of materials, and once those materials were found, say in Tennessee or Virginia or Georgia, wherever they might be, they had the issues of trying to get them via rail to the city. Not only were the two ironclads competing with each other, and they were competing with each other for materials to be built, but they were also competing with every single other defensive and military building project within the Confederacy. And remember, New Orleans was not high on the priority list for materials and manpower. Now, to give credit to the Confederate leadership, they didn't think that New Orleans was defenseless. Because the defense of New Orleans did not just rest on two partially built ironclads and a handful of smaller wooden vessels, but there were two major forts defending the city on the southern approach to New Orleans. There was Fort St. Philippe, shown up here, which was built from the War of 1812, built upon old Spanish fortifications. And then there was Fort Jackson, which was a much more modern fort, built and finished in 1832, and it was a modern star fort with significant capabilities, in theory, if they had enough guns, powder, cannonballs, and manpower. They were defended by Brigadier General Duncan, like the gentleman I mentioned before, and he was a capable commander. But both forts were lacking in the heavy modern artillery they needed and good powder and shot. Lovell even had to create a powder factory, or powder works in the city just to have enough to sustain and supply the two forts they had. And it still wasn't enough, but at least he tried. There's also a blocking chain laid across the river right here, which is designed to stop ships encroaching going northward. But it had recently been damaged by high water and debris, and they simply did not have enough manpower to fix it in time. But in theory, these forts, combined with the chain and the soon-to-be-built ironclads, could stop a Union fleet trying to attack New Orleans. Remember the famous quote from Admiral Horatio Nelson, "A ship's a fool to fight a fort." It is very dangerous as a wooden ship to go up against a fortification with modern artillery. You look at the War of 1812 and Fort St. Philippe. When the British came up the river, they tried to bombard and stop Fort St. Philippe to get up the Mississippi River, and they were stopped dead cold. They were not able to pass the fort. So leaders from the Confederacy understood that there was significant defenses here. But the fact of the matter was, they were undersupplied, undermanned, and undergunned. A bigger issue was command and control. Duncan had control of the forts, but he had no authority, just like Lovell had no overall authority of the Navy, on those gunboats and the ironclads that were supposed to defend and work in concert with him to defend the river and defend the city. There's a lot of inter-service bickering and no clear strategy. So that sets the scene. The Union came. During late February and March of 1862, the Union Navy, a naval force consisting of 17 warships, mostly steamships, few sailing vessels, under the overall command of David Glassell Farragut, these 17 warships slowly worked their way past the sandbars and the obstructions of the mouth of the Mississippi River, and began to position itself to run past the two forts and attack the city of New Orleans. The Union plan to deal with the two forts came in the form of 20 additional gunboats equipped with 13-inch mortars. Right here. David Dixon Porter was in charge of these squadron of ships. He thought and argued that through bombardment, the forts were going to be destroyed or forced to surrender without the need to run past the warships or attack them with army troops by land. He figured with just bombardment, they were going to be successful. April 18th, the bombardment of the forts began. Had a good effect. Knocked out gun emplacements, started fires, and constant bombardment really affected the morale of the two forts defenders. In fact, so much so that once the ships ran past the forts, there was a mutiny in the forts and they surrendered. But it was not the decisive bombardment that Porter had promised. The forts just did not surrender. In many ways, that actually reminds me of when I talk to my students about future wars and air power, and how so many times air power is promised decisive effect, and so many times it comes up short. But that's neither here nor there. So, the mortars have some success, but ultimately fail. So they have to run the forts. By April 24th, Farragut decided that they couldn't wait any longer, that they needed to push forward, and the forts were not going to be reduced by just mortar fire, and he decided to run past the forts with his main force. Early in the morning, two small boats snuck up to the chain barrier across the river and cut it, and forced openings for the bigger ships. They sent the signal to Farragut's force, who then began to steam past the forts through the gaps in the chain, under fire from both Fort Jackson and St. Philippe. And 14 of the 17 ships made it successfully past. And of those, only one, a converted merchantman, so not even a by design warship, sunk. Only one ship sunk, a converted merchantman. But other than that, 14 of the 17 ships made it past successfully. Even the sailing ships, like the USS Hartford, made it past successfully. They were towed by the steamships as they went past. Interestingly, to note, thinking about what could have been and alternate courses of action. Louisiana, which was being used as a floating gun platform and only had 4 guns of the 16 that she was supposed to have, it was fired on significantly, but her armor was impregnable. They took no damage being shot at from Farragut's force, despite being fired on by every ship passing it. So let's think about that for later. The end result was Farragut made it past the forts and sailed up to the city with no other resistance. And he anchored at the city and threatened to bombard them. A city with a population of 160,000 people. Lovell, by that point, had taken what army defenders they had and left, retreated in good order rather than risk the city be destroyed. The city's civilian leadership was in no possible position to say no to Farragut. They did try and delay a little bit, but ultimately they couldn't do anything lest New Orleans be bombarded into oblivion. And so, by April 29th, 1862, the largest and most economically important city in the Confederacy was in Union hands. And its loss was symptomatic of the larger strategic problems of the Confederacy. They didn't understand the nature of the war. They didn't understand how New Orleans fit within their strategic situation and how strategically they needed New Orleans to both achieve their King Cotton diplomacy and their diplomatic overtures to Great Britain and France. And it suffered, the defense of New Orleans was suffered from the same issues that plagued the larger Confederacy, with manufacturing, a lack of a strong and successful naval vision, and poor leadership issues. And there were alternate courses of action, right? You can always, something we talk, Dave and I talk heavily with our students, is thinking about strategic courses of action. Think about what could have been different. What if they would have built 1 ironclad instead of 2 in New Orleans? And all that effort and money and material would have gone to, say, the Mississippi as opposed, not Mississippi, the Louisiana as opposed to Mississippi. They could have had more troops and arms for defending the city instead of draining the city of all its defenders for battles elsewhere. And they could have had better cooperation and command and control for Army and Navy forces. Heck, there could have been even larger policy issues. Sell all your cotton in '61. Try and get it out before the blockade hits, as opposed to trying to force the hand of Great Britain and France. And we can talk about these during the Q&A section. I've read extensively on this topic, both primary sources, secondary sources, and I've still not gotten a satisfactory answer as to why the Confederate leadership was so concerned with the northern part of the Mississippi and Tennessee as opposed to New Orleans as the key strategic issue for the Mississippi. And I'm curious to start off the Q&A session of your thoughts. Does anyone have an idea or what you think why New Orleans was essentially ignored for so long during the war and it fell so quickly? I'm going to open it up to you guys. Any thoughts?
The Union successes, Union losses in the prior period, maybe they took their resources and put them in a spot and it actually worked. And there was so much Union loss right through that whole period.
That's fair. Fair point. Take your resources and put them where they can have the best effect. Any other thoughts?
Isn't it difficult to split attention?
It is. And that's the big strategic issue with this war in general. With the Confederacy is they embarked on a war in which they were not prepared for, and then they were forced to split and divide their forces and defend the entire country with stuff and material they didn't have. And that's a fair point.
Did the cotton trade fade away because of England and France not participating?
Yes, so what essentially happened was the cotton trade in '61, France and England kind of endured the lack of cotton, but they also started finding other sellers. They bought from Egypt, they bought from the north, they found other areas to source their cotton. And actually what ended up happening is as the Union took more and more territory and captured more and more cotton, that stuff that wasn't burnt, they would repackage it and sell it, send it up north, and merchants up north would sell it right back to England. So England was getting their cotton no matter what. It's just the South was unable, by the time they realized they needed to sell cotton, the South was unable, they were blocked, New Orleans fell, and for the most part, other major ports were blockaded, and they couldn't easily get the cotton out even if they wanted to.
Perhaps that may have been the reason why they had their attention and tendency to sell New Orleans. Couldn't sell the cotton.
That's a good point, but they needed to, I thought about that. The big issue though is if your goal eventually is to sell the cotton, if you want, you need to have New Orleans open, because it doesn't matter if your ports up in the northern part of the Mississippi are open. If you can't get it through New Orleans and get it out into the Gulf or east to, say, Charleston, you're not going to be able to sell it whether you have it or not, because of lack of infrastructure. Are there any other questions?
Was it perhaps more important to protect the capital of Richmond? And, I mean, Lincoln's administration was so fearful of the Confederates coming in there, they always kept a ton of troops there. And now they're protecting, I mean, they had such a massive area to try and protect, they had to make some decision for their boundary lines. I mean, when they started losing Fort Henry, you know, and the forts up in the northern part that lead into the Mississippi, you know, that was a big struggle because they cut off that other half of the country.
That's a fair point. And yeah, the issue of having your capital be so close to the border is you have to defend, you have to assign troops and an army to make sure that's defended. That's a fair point. Any other questions? Open up to everything.
Yeah, did Grant capture Vicksburg before or after the battle?
After. Vicksburg was 63.
63.
So, and Henry Donaldson was 62. But yeah, so that was after the fact.
Okay.
New Orleans was the first major city and area on the Mississippi to fall to the Union.
What is your read on Jefferson, his cabinet, where Jefferson Davis says his cabinet, his lead military advisors, people like Lee, what are they talking about early 1862? Does New Orleans even fall within that framework of their grander strategy for the war? Or are they just totally, I just wonder sometimes, if you are a nation that by its nature, at least by their claim, states decentralization, concerned with states' rights, quote unquote, at what point do all of these people, these leaders, are they shaped by concern for their own state rather than the entire country?
That is a great point. And in my research and readings, you can see that. In fact, you have fights between Georgia and Louisiana in terms of where troops and cannon are going to go, because they're arguing back and forth as to who needs what. With Jefferson Davis's cabinet in general, the argument that this is it's a confederation of states and they're all worried, the problem is huge. And when it comes to New Orleans, it was kind of, I read that it was kind of out of sight, out of mind. I think they realized it was important, but they didn't think about it that much. No one really thought about New Orleans that much. It was the black sheep of the South. It was a weird city compared to the rest of the South. And they really put a lot of emphasis on the forts and a lot of emphasis on that on Mallory's shipbuilding program and how that was going to save them. But I really don't know if they thought enough about it. They were annoyed. Lovell sent them a bunch of letters saying, "Hey, we need more stuff. This is bad. We need." But G.D.P. Benjamin and Stephen R. Mallory and Davis, especially, they were they were focused on other things, and to their detriment, right? One of the things I argued is that they didn't really understand the nature of the war. They didn't understand how, they didn't have a successful concept of how to win, other than outlast the Union's will to fight. And the reason why I think they didn't think about it that much, as much as they should have, is because of the sheer surprise when it falls. It is like a shot across the bow for a wake-up call for the entirety of the Confederate leadership. They are beside themselves for how, because not only does New Orleans falling, it's their biggest, most important city, yes, but that's also strategically super important for the Mississippi. Now they have to deal with the Union both coming up from the south and coming down from the north on the Mississippi and bifurcating the Confederacy. And that becomes, but they didn't really think of it. Like I said, this occurs a little over a year after the war started. They really don't have time, and they needed to have time, or they needed to think about it differently. But yeah, that's a good point about I think it's mostly out of sight, out of mind.
You paint a very bleak picture of the Confederacy supplies and strategies, but they lasted a long time, did a lot of damage.
They did. So I would argue they lasted alongside. I paint a bleak picture primarily of the Confederate naval aspect. The most successful aspect of the Confederate Navy was their commerce raiders, like the Alabama, but ultimately those commerce raiders did not have a very good effect on the war, and they did not achieve their objectives. They needed to stop the blockade, because you're not gonna, if you can't get your goods out, and if you're blockaded and you're being slowly strangled, you can last a long time. I mean, let's look at other wars where they hold out for a long time, and they can do a fair amount of damage, but ultimately they were unsuccessful. And I think that's the Confederacy in a nutshell. We can talk more about their strategy and their lack of dynamism and their issues at Antietam and Gettysburg and so on and so forth. But really, their biggest issue was they were being strangled from a naval perspective, and they had no response other than a couple of commerce raiders. And commerce raiding was not going to win the war.
President Davis and Vice President Douglas, did their papers give any indication of perhaps they were more focused on something than from the question of law?
Yes, I mean they're focused on a bunch of issues related to the entirety of the war. I'm not saying that they talk. One of my big argument, what struck me when I read those papers, is that it's not that they're talking about how important New Orleans is, and then they're not devoting resources to defend it. It's they're not talking a lot about New Orleans in general, despite the economic and strategic importance of the city to the Confederacy. Because you're not going to be able to sell your cotton. You're not going to be able to access the Gulf easily. There's Mobile and there's Pensacola. Well, no, Pensacola's gone by this point. But there's Mobile and a couple other areas. But you're not going to be able to easily access it or access the money and the merchants required if New Orleans falls. I would argue that they are overwhelmed. They are aware of New Orleans and they're aware of the issues, which is one of the reasons why they're okay with Twigs. But it's ad hoc. When they assign Twigs was in their good graces because he gave up a federal fort and storehouse in Texas, and then turned to the Confederacy. And they gave him that post as kind of like it's New Orleans, he'll be fine there, and then he ended up being too sick. They didn't give it. I would argue they didn't give it the importance it required as a city of its caliber for the war.
There's always this conflict between planning and acting. Mm-hmm. And at times, across the board, officials are planning for the future. You could be acting and create momentum. You could win, and if you win, you build support from your group.
Mhm.
They become more active. But if you're just planning, it becomes doom.
Mhm.
Everyone is just sitting around thinking about this nebulous future.
That's true. But the issue was the Confederacy wasn't winning enough to even do that. That's another thing is when we talk about diplomatic recognition, I talk about the American Revolution as an example. The American patriots needed Saratoga, and they needed victories to convince France that they were worth backing. The Confederacy never had that. Now, and you could argue that if New Orleans remains intact and the blockade is broken and they control those waterways, that might have gone towards convincing policymakers in France and Great Britain that maybe this might be worth backing. They can actually, but I think the opposite happened. New Orleans fell, and there's diplomatic issues with Lincoln, obviously, but not to the scale that they're going to change course. Because you also have to convince Great Britain and France that it's worth supporting a slave-owning state or slave-owning country, and you have to convince them that the economics outweigh the moral issues with that. And good point.
I mean, it's obvious that, the South had a lot fewer soldiers and manpower supplies. I think there was a decision that let's put the good people in Virginia or in the East, and over there, whatever's left over, we'll give them. I mean, you can only send your best people in so many places.
I mean, I don't know if that was a conscious decision. I also don't know if they really, in 61, but between 61 and 62, the time that we're talking about, I don't think you know who the good people are, right? I mean, take Twiggs, for example.
Yeah.
If you look at his record, if you look at his service record, he fought in all the major wars that the United States fought in during the first half of the 18th century or 19th century. And in theory, he's going to be a great general. But in practicality, he did nothing, and he was sick, and he was tired, and he just didn't have the energy to devote to doing that. So I don't think during 61, they even know who is their who the best is. I think maybe down the road that could be it, but that's not my specialty, and so I'm hesitant to talk more about that or with any type of authority.
The new boats that were created,
Mm-hmm.
how many soldiers and troops are on each boat in general?
So in general, for Louisiana and Mississippi, they're normal ironclads. They're going to be, I don't remember offhand, but probably like 200, 300, 400. It's a warship. It's a significant amount, maybe a little bit less than that. It's not like the three-decker of the previous 50 years where you're running 800, 900 people on a third rate, but it's significant. And the smaller boats, the gunboats, the rams, would have a dozen or two people operating those, depending on the make. Again, another thing to point out, there's no unified shipbuilding program. The Mississippi and Louisiana look very different. Like I emphasize, Murray was a shipbuilder and he knew his stuff. The Tiff brothers had no idea what they were doing, and it would have been better had the Tiff brothers maybe their project been subsumed by Louisiana and Murray. But it's a significant amount, and you need skilled sailors to be able to run those. Any other questions?
I guess I'll be the last one. The conversation has led me to think of, and I look to you, Professor Calhoun, because you're the military historian in the room, not a military historian. The DIME acronym, diplomacy, I can't remember I, military, and economy. And I wonder, to what extent is the Confederacy's decision-making focusing too much on the M and ignoring the rest of the whole Clausewitz, right? Politics by another means kind of idea, like, are we missing the fact that the economy and the diplomacy is just as important as fighting the war in the field of military forces?
Great point. Now, Clausewitz didn't design DIME, but Clausewitz would have said, you have to focus on the military. Now, Clausewitz would have said, concentrate your forces, attack DC. Go decide, figure out the center of gravity, concentrate your forces, and once you achieve that goal, the rest is going to follow. The issue is, if you can't do that, or if you're unsuccessful in being able to do that, the things like diplomacy, and intelligence, and economics are super important. And they did have diplomatic overtures. The problem is, in part because of King Cotton diplomacy, and also, so they're a slave-based society, and so they got that going against them for Great Britain and France. They are practicing King Cotton diplomacy. They're restricting them from selling when they could sell. And so the one product that they sold to the British and the French of any significance, they're not getting. And so they really don't have, and then by that time, the blockades constricting, and New Orleans falls, and constricting, and other cities fall, and they don't have any diplomatic levers. That's the problem. It gets to the point where they're just like, please, can you recognize us? We really need the help. They don't have any. Now, and Great Britain and France had no real reason to hate the Union. France, in the War for American Independence, hated the British. That's the big reason why they did it, is because this was going to stick the British one. But during the Civil War, they needed diplomatic levers, and with the loss of New Orleans and the use of King Cotton diplomacy, they didn't have any levers to pull, in my opinion. There might be some scholars of Civil War diplomacy that would disagree with me, but they're not here. I don't think. If they are, feel free to yell at me afterwards. Thank you so much.